Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Khalil and Andani, and today we're going to be discussing the so-called Islamic dilemma. So, Khalil, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then after that, can you tell us a bit about what is the so-called Islamic dilemma?
Sure. So I am an assistant professor of religion. I teach at a liberal arts college, and my training is primarily in Islamic studies. So I hold a PhD and 2 master's degrees in Islamic studies. My specializations include the academic critical study of the Quran, as well as other areas such as Islamic philosophy, Islamic history. And part of my professional role is to engage in interfaith dialogue, often with Christians, as well as with people of other faiths. So I'm primarily coming from an academic side. That being said, I am from a Muslim family. I am a practicing Shia Ismaili Muslim, so I have that interest in these topics as well.
What is the Islamic dilemma?
Sure. So would it be okay if I showed it like on a slide?
Of course.
All right. So I'll just do that. Okay, so this is just a slide I prepared. So the Islamic dilemma is an argument that I believe it originates in the 18th or 19th century with Christian missionaries who come to Muslim populated lands primarily through colonialism. And according to my information, it's these Christian missionaries who are aligned with the British or the French or the Dutch or the Germans. They start using this sort of argument when they first start debating or dialoguing with Muslims in places like South Asia, for example. So the argument runs like this. So premise 1, it is claimed that the Quran confirms the divine inspiration, the authority, and the preservation of the New Testament that is possessed by Christians. Premise 2, the Quran also contradicts certain teachings found within the New Testament as Christians interpret the text. Premise 3, if the Quran is true, then the New Testament must be true. Premise 4, but the New Testament teaches doctrines such as the Trinity or the divinity of Christ, according to Christians, which contradict the Quran. Therefore, the Quran must be false. So at least that's one rendition of it. I've seen some other slightly different renditions. So another sort of parallel rendition would be the Quran confirms the New Testament. If the New Testament is corrupted, then the Quran is false because the Quran is confirming a false book, for example. So that's like a parallel version of it. So that's basically the dilemma itself. I wonder if you don't mind. I've watched many episodes on your channel, particularly because you really bring some great academics in the field of early Christianity and biblical studies to your channel. And I've quite enjoyed those episodes. So what sort of made you get interested in this topic of the Islamic dilemma, which strictly speaking is not really, it's not an academic argument. This is what you would call a polemical argument, or it's at best a theological argument. So I'm just curious why you took an interest to this particular issue.
Well, I heard a lot about it, and so I wanted to get somebody on the channel to talk to me about it, to tell me what it is and what is their position on it, and really get the opinions of both sides. I typically do exactly this. I've had similar treatments of other polemical positions and different topics as well.
Okay. Well, this is basically what the argument says, and basically, the way I'm coming at this is that I'm interested in the general question, which could just be an academic question: does the Quran even confirm or affirm the Christian New Testament? Right, like that premise by itself, that's a question that can be explored from an academic perspective, regardless of whether one is a Muslim or a non-Muslim. So I came to this topic because I was always interested in that first question: what does the Quran mean when it uses the word gospel affiliated with Jesus, for example? And I had already done my own research on that, just the topic of what is the gospel in the Quran. I have other colleagues in the Quranic studies field who've done the same research, and about two or three of us, we all came to the same conclusion on what that answer was. And then the reason why I got involved in this particular debate is that I found that the way this argument is run, the argument, in my opinion, does not engage with actual scholarship on the academic critical study of the Quran. And if it did, some of these premises would definitely become weaker, if not, outright get overturned. That's at least how I see this issue.
And when you look at the Quran in its reference to the gospel, how do you take it? What do you think it's talking about when it mentions that?
Sure, that's a great question. So that actually brings me to like the summary of like what the different responses by Muslims to the dilemma would be. So I debated this issue about 1 year ago on another channel, maybe you haven't seen it, I'm not sure. But over there, I was able to find in the literature, there's three responses. So the first response directly bears on your question. What does the Quran actually confirm, for example? Or what does the Quran mean when it refers to something by the word Injil in Arabic, which would correspond to Evangelion in Greek or gospel in English? So the position that I take, which I can support with my own research into the Quranic text, as well as a similar, the position that, could be rooted in other academic studies, is that when the Quran talks about the gospel, singular, it is specifically talking about a revelatory message from God that is given directly to Jesus and which is taught by Jesus from his own mouth. That's what the Quran means by the word gospel. And you'll notice that only the singular term Injil is used in the Quran. There's no reference in the Quran to multiple gospels in the plural. So already what we have here is the Quran has defined the term gospel in a very, very particular way, i.e., the revelatory teaching of Jesus, like what he actually taught. And already at the conceptual level, one has to admit that the gospel as the revelatory message of Jesus does not comport with how today's Christians, or even Christians after a certain point, how they understand the term gospel. Because today, when you hear the word gospel by Christians, they might be referring to the New Testament message as a whole, right? They might be referring to the entire New Testament, which is 27 books. They might be referring to the four, what I'm going to call biographical gospels, which, as you know, Jacob, because you've had so many of these scholars on the show, the four biographical gospels are anonymous writings or tellings about Jesus, right? They're not like the verbatim words of Jesus. So they're you could say the four biographical gospels are narrations about Jesus. So already, in my view, the Quran's concept of gospel differs from the more popular conventional Christian idea of gospel, which is 4 gospels or possibly the New Testament. So therefore, in the first response to the Islamic dilemma, the Quran is actually not affirming the New Testament canon of 27 books, nor is it affirming the 4 Christian gospels. What the Quran is talking about and what it is affirming is a revelatory message that was given to Jesus and that was preached by Jesus during his lifetime, which the Christian New Testament claims to convey, but does not actually provide us in a verbatim transcript or anything of that sort. So this view, which is the view I take, and that's the view that I've argued for, it can be backed by a very straightforward analysis of the Quran. It also happens to be the position that the vast majority of Muslims across denominations have taken. And therefore, from this perspective, the Islamic dilemma fails right out of the gate, because the Quran does not affirm the inspiration, authority, and preservation of the New Testament. At best, the Quran is affirming certain teachings that go back to the historical Jesus, which with some effort, anybody could find embedded within the 4 gospels that the Christians have. So that would be sort of my preferred response to the Islamic dilemma. And of course, if you want, I could go into more detail on like how we know that the term gospel refers to this as opposed to anything else.
Sure.
Okay, so why don't we go into that? So the general rule, I believe, is when we're asking what does a text mean by a certain word, in this case, the word gospel, the general rule I like to take is we should read the text holistically. We should find all the instances of that word, in this case, in the Quran, and we should look at the meaning of the word and all the mentions of it, and only then will we have a clear picture of what a certain term means. So this is basically what I did. So the general context, when the Quran talks about revelation, the Quran uses a particular word for revelation, and a word that is often mistranslated. So the word the Quran uses to talk about revelation to prophets in general is the word kitab in Arabic. And most people today, they just translate the word as book, okay? But in 7th century Arabia, this word kitab did not really mean a physical book or an embodied book. Kitab, in its earliest and in its root meaning, has more of the sense of divine decree or divine prescription. So often throughout the Quran, it says that God has given kitab, divine prescription, to all the prophets. And this you can see in many of these verses. So this first verse says that God sent prophets and he sent down with them the kitab, singular, which just means the divine decree, the divine prescription. The second verse, it says God sent with all the prophets kitab, divine decree, and hikmah, which means wisdom. And this is going to become important in a few moments. In an early surah of the Quran, Jesus says, I am the servant of God. He has given me the kitab, singular, and maybe a prophet. And the point of this little exploration here is to underscore the fact that when the Quran talks about a kitab being given to a prophet, this does not necessitate a physical book. Okay, a kitab is not necessarily a physical book, and frankly, in most cases, when it comes to prophetic revelation, kitab in the Quran does not denote a physical book. Rather, a divine message in the Quran is called a kitab, and I'm quoting Daniel Madigan, who's a scholar of the Quran and a Catholic priest. It's called a kitab not because of its form, but because it carries authority as a manifestation of divine command and divine knowledge. So that's the first point. When the Quran says that God gave a kitab to Jesus, we should not just look at this and say, okay, this means that God gave the New Testament to Jesus. Or when the Quran refers to people who read or recite the kitab, that was revealed in the past, that does not necessarily, or that does not even entail that it's talking about a physical canon of scripture. So that's the first point. But we can keep going. So now, if we have a general understanding of Quranic terms for revelation, we can specifically go into what is the gospel. So the Quranic Jesus, according to the Quranic narrative, and this point escapes a lot of people, the Quranic Jesus is ascribed with bringing not one, but two revelatory messages. The Quran refers to these as the Torah and the Gospel. And in other verses, it refers to it as the Kitab, the divine prescription, and the wisdom. So already in the Quran, we have a very clear idea that Jesus brought the Torah and the Gospel. And again, these are not defined as physical books or physical canons. Nowhere does the Quran describe Jesus carrying around a library of books, such as, the Old Testament or the New Testament. Rather, the message of Jesus is called Torah and Gospel because the Torah and the Gospel correspond to the general idea of kitab, divine prescription, and hikmah, divine wisdom. So Jesus in the Quran is a prophet who brings divine law, kitab, which is Torah, and the inner meaning or the inner wisdom associated with that divine law, which is what the Quran calls hikmah, or in the case of Jesus, gospel, Injil. So when we look at later verses of the Quran, which say, we gave him, Jesus, the gospel singular, we have to sort of keep all of this in mind. So in other words, according to the Quran, the gospel is the words of Jesus. That's all it is. And the Torah would also be part of the words of Jesus from a Quranic perspective. The question that people ask is, well, how does this idea of the gospel relate to what Christians today call the gospel? Well, you can find the gospel of Jesus, which is what the Quran confirms and what the Quran talks about. You can find that today insofar as the words of Jesus are preserved in the 4 biographical gospels. And you've had many scholars on your show, like James Tabor and Bart Ehrman, and most historians will concede that with some probability, the words, or at least the sense of the historical Jesus teachings, could be recovered from the 4 gospels. However, not everything ascribed to Jesus in the 4 gospels was actually said by him. So what the Quran is confirming when it talks about the gospel singular is only the actual words that the historical Jesus said. It's not confirming things that were later ascribed or put in the mouth of Jesus. And of course, the 4 Gospels themselves are still a small subset of a 27-book New Testament. So my point here then is, you can search through the entire Quran. You will never find one verse that refers to the 4 Gospels, nor will you find any verse that refers to, let alone confirms, the 27-book New Testament canon. So the first part of the Islamic dilemma, in my opinion anyway, it cannot be sustained. Now, at this point, some people will say that the author of the Quran, he might just be mistaken. Maybe he didn't know that the Christians have 4 Gospels, or maybe he didn't know about the New Testament. Because where does this idea of one gospel come from? So what I found very interesting is the early Christians, before the Bible was canonized, before the New Testament was canonized, early Christians, including the 4 Gospels themselves, they talk about one gospel as the teaching of Jesus. So in the Gospel of Mark, we read already in the first chapter, and then it's repeated several times, that Jesus went into Galilee, or he went into the towns, and he proclaimed the gospel, euangelion, singular. In Matthew, same thing, that Jesus went to the towns and villages and the synagogues, proclaiming the gospel, euangelion, of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. Already at this point, I would propose that the Quranic idea of gospel being the teaching of Jesus is in accord with an idea or narrative found within the four gospels, that the message of Jesus was actually called the gospel. So there's actually a remarkable convergence on this particular point. The other thing to remember is the Quran credits Jesus with what I call a dyadic revelation, right? A twofold revelation. So according to the Quran, Jesus taught Torah and gospel. The gospel would be the wisdom or the inner meaning of the Torah. And again, this comports very well with what we know of the historical Jesus. I think there's a consensus now that the historical Jesus was not only Torah observant, but he taught his disciples that they have to be observant to the Mosaic law. And this is why in the book of Acts, for example, and this is something we can come back to, we see that the early Jewish Christian community is described in Acts 21, I believe, as zealous for the law. So the early disciples of Jesus, you could say the first Christians, are actually Torah observant Jews. And this is completely in line with how the Quran presents Jesus as well as the disciples of Jesus. There are other Christian documents that postdate the New Testament writings, such as the Didache, where again, the teaching of Jesus is called the gospel, his gospel, or the gospel of our Lord. And to my knowledge, the first attestation of four gospels, that is, four biographies about Jesus being canon, is from Irenaeus, who is in the late 2nd century. So we have a big gap from the idea of one gospel, which we find in the New Testament and in the Didache, to the idea of four gospels. And some scholars have remarked that perhaps there is this idea of one gospel that actually pushed through because some of the early attempts at a scriptural canon from early Christians included the idea that even from a written perspective, there should only be one exclusive gospel as opposed to, more than one. So what I'm basically saying then is not only is there no Islamic dilemma, but what the Quran is doing, if we read it integrally, is it seems to be recovering an ancient Christian idea of one gospel being the teaching of Jesus as opposed to many gospels. Now, on a related point, there's also positive evidence. So in addition to what I just shared shows that when the Quran talks about gospel, it doesn't even mean the New Testament. But then there's positive evidence elsewhere in the Quran where the Quran does assert that the Jewish and Christian communities corrupted the revelation that they had received in different ways. I'm not going to read all the verses, but I thought, for full disclosure, we should just show people what those verses are. So we have, for example, like, do not clothe the truth with falsehood or conceal the truth. Some people are accused of exchanging what they were given for error. Another verse says, it talks about people who write the kitab, i.e., people who write the divine prescription with their own hands, and then they say this is from God. This particular accusation, which is the third verse here, this is particularly important because effectively what Muslims would say about the New Testament is that the New Testament, from a Muslim perspective, is a mixture of genuine revelation and other statements which are alleged to be revelation, but which are actually not. And by this, I would refer to different accretions, different words that are ascribed to the historical Jesus, which he never said, or the letters and writings of Paul and the pseudo-Pauline epistles. These are just letters written by people, but it's the Christian church that said, these letters are divinely inspired. That directly falls into Quran 279 over here. The next verse, why do you mix the truth with falsehood? That also speaks to what I said. And so these are several verses which accuse the people of the book in the Quran, which includes Jews and Christians, of corrupting revelation. And I need to be very clear. When I say corrupting revelation, this is not merely the claim that the New Testament in its textual transmission has undergone some changes. That's not the problem that the Quran is talking about. What the Quran is saying is that at an initial stage, before the New Testament is even canonized, these Christian communities, what they allege to be revelation is actually not revelation in the first place, irrespective of whether that alleged revelation gets transmitted faithfully. I mean, one could even grant that, although I know there's a lot of variance in New Testament transmission, but one could grant that, okay, the New Testament writings have been perfectly transmitted, no problem. That's not the problem that the Quran is raising. What the Quran is saying is that the actual message, when it became canonized into what you call the New Testament, that is when false revelation gets mixed with true revelation. Now, I read these verses as alleging that the Jewish and Christian scriptures are corrupted. That's how I read them. But it's not just me. The majority of both Western academics who've written about this, as well as Muslim scholars, both groups in a majority say that the Quran does allege that Jewish and Christian scriptures have been textually corrupted. And to support that statement, I'm quoting Professor Walid Saleh of the University of Toronto. He wrote a review article on this topic where he was refuting a Christian scholar who alleged otherwise. And this is what Walid Saleh says. The scholarly consensus is that the Quran does indeed make the charge of Jewish and Christian scriptures have been textually corrupted. A final example of why I believe the Quran does not confirm the New Testament is that there have been many studies which closely engage with the Quran. Again, this is from an academic perspective, just like, people can engage any text as a historical artifact, and you can find out by reading the text within its context what it's responding to, irrespective of whether you think it's from God. So there are studies that have shown that the Quran consciously opposes, corrects, and re-narrates biblical material. This is a whole laundry list of them, right? Where the Quran, it may retell a biblical story, it may correct a biblical story. Let me just give you a very quick example. So if you read the book of Genesis, okay, in the book of Genesis, the narrative tells you that the Lord, God, visited Abraham in the form of 3 human beings. Okay, so it says the Lord visited Abraham, but then it says that Abraham saw 3 men. And if you read the narrative, it's actually unclear from reading the book of Genesis whether the 3 men are God or whether they're angels. Like from Genesis alone, you cannot tell. It could go either way. And many Christians use that passage to argue for the Trinity, for example. The Quran retells the story of the visit to Abraham, but the Quran makes it very clear that the 3 people who visited Abraham are the messengers of God. And at no point in the story does the Quran ever say that God visited Abraham, right? So that's just one example among others where the Quran purposely corrects or retells with modification a biblical story. Another final example of just this point, the Quran specifically engages with the Christian 4 Gospels. There's a study by Imran al-Badawi, published as the Quran and the Aramaic Gospel Traditions, where al-Badawi did an amazing job where he read the Quran very closely and he sort of collated Quranic passages with passages in the New Testament. And what he found in numerous cases, not every case, in some cases, the Quran agrees with something in the New Testament and it retells it in agreement. But in many cases, the Quranic retelling is a correction to something that you find ascribed to Jesus in Matthew or Mark or John. Sometimes the Quran even engaged with the letters of Paul. If you want an example of agreement, in this case, the Quranic opening prayer, Surat al-Fatiha, is re-articulating the Lord's Prayer. And more or less, there's actually agreement when it comes to the Lord's Prayer and the Fatiha. But on other matters, the Quran is like actively disagreeing with the teaching that's put in the mouth of Jesus in the Gospels. Overall, the Quran is in a 20% the Gospel of Matthew demonstrates a 20% dialogue with the Quran out of the 4 Gospels, but the Quran is actually interacting with material across all 4 Gospels. So whoever the author of the Quran is, again, like, you don't have to believe that this is from God. It could be from anybody, but the author of the Quran, in my view, and in the view of Ehrman al-Badawi, among others, the author of the Quran is familiar with the material in the New Testament, in the 4 Gospels, and the Quranic author has purposely, taken a path where he does not confirm the teachings in this New Testament or the 4 Gospels. But at the same time, there are some teachings that you can find in the 4 Gospels or in the Bible broadly. There are some teachings that the Quran is in agreement with. So there's a partial confirmation, and there's also a partial correction. That's what's actually going on in the Quran. There's more I could share, but for the sake of not speaking for too long, let me just pause here, Jacob, if you had any questions, comments, or input or anything like that.
And so my question would be, is, like, how do critical scholars, both either believing or non-believing scholars, that are examining the Quran critically or something to that effect, how do they go about analyzing the Quran, distinct from those that look at it from the perspective of the Islamic dilemma?
Sure. So Quranic studies is a very large field now. There's an institution that sort of hosts this called the International Quranic Studies Association. So generally, what critical historical scholars of the Quran do is they read the Quran and they interpret its terminologies and its phrases and its rhetoric, its literary features. They interpret it in conversation with other texts of late antiquity. Those other texts include biblical commentaries, post-biblical literatures, post-biblical gospels, for example. Those other texts also include the rabbinical tradition. So I'll give you an example of this in a bit, where you can actually refer to the rabbinical writings, like the Talmud, to actually contextualize what the Quran is saying. For example, I'll give you 2 examples because they came up in your last video, and we can get to that at some point. The crucifixion verse in the Quran, where the Quran allegedly denies that Jesus was crucified. In my view, and in the view of other critical scholars, the best way to understand that is in reference to what the Talmud and some other Jewish writings of late antiquity, what they say about Jesus. And if you do that, then the standard reading of the crucifixion verse is going to change. Another example, which was just presented recently, there's a scholar named Holger Zelentin. And again, I'll show you the details of this in a bit. But Holger Zelentin commented, he just gave a talk on the verse that you asked about last time. You asked, why does the Quran accuse Jews of considering Ezra as the son of God? So Holger Zelentin, he, in a conference paper not too long ago, he actually answered this question, and he found the answer in rabbinical sources. So that's generally what historical critical scholars do. They read the Quran in the context of other late antique writings, and overall, this serves to illuminate what the Quran meant when it first came on the scene. Because it's one thing to say, what does the Quran, and we can ask about the Bible too. What does the text mean to us today versus what did this text mean when it first appeared? And it's the job of the historical critical scholar to do their best work to recover the earliest meaning of that text for its earliest audience. Because, meaning is actually a relative thing, right? A text only has meaning in relation to an audience. Text, they don't have just meaning like sitting alone in the sky. So what scholars have to do is they have to understand the original audience, their environment, and then they can actually derive what was the meaning of the Quran for the original audience. This is not very different from how scholars you've interviewed, how those scholars study the Bible or the New Testament.
I'd like to come back to the Ezra thing in a moment because I do have a super chat question that's been asked about that. But the first super chat's from Solar Knight. Thank you for your super chat. Dr. Andani, do you perceive a time when humanity will grow out of religions altogether, entering a non-superstitious global age of Aquarianism?
Look, I'm not a sociologist of religion, so it's hard for me to answer that from a professional standpoint. I can just answer personally that, about 10, maybe about 20 years ago, so around early 2000s, there was a lot of talk from the new atheist movement, people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and the rest. There was a lot of talk from them that, we would eventually outgrow religion. However, 20 years later, that's not what I see happening in the world. In fact, we're seeing some new atheists, namely Richard Dawkins and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who in the last few years have come to admit publicly a religious identity, even though they may not, believe in a traditional sense. Richard Dawkins now calls himself a cultural Christian. He never did that before. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was, an atheist, famous atheist, skeptic, right? She's now a Christian. And overall, around the world, when I look at cultural patterns, I don't see a general movement away from religion. I think religion will continue to be a major social, global, political factor in the world. I think that even atheists, if they don't turn to religion, atheists still have ontological beliefs, right? Atheists or agnostics as well, they still have worldviews. And in that sense, we have to also inquire, and there's a whole topic in itself, but like what counts as a religion anyway? I mean, there's no objective definition of what constitutes a religion in the first place. Is a religion just a belief system? Well, then many things are a religion, does religion just require rituals? Well, there are many things beyond traditional religion that have rituals. Is religion just an identity marker? Well, a zillion things can't count as religion. So there's also this greater issue of like what even counts as a religion. We're sort of arbitrary in what we label religion and what we don't.
Steve Sinead, thank you for your super chat. Extra biblical offers confirm Jesus' death on the cross. How do you reconcile this with the Quran? Likewise, what Jewish sect called Ezra son of God?
Okay, so that's two questions in one. Okay, no problem. So basically, and I'll show this as well. But my position on the crucifixion in the Quran is simply that I do not believe the Quran even denies the crucifixion. I think the Quran affirms the crucifixion. That's my take. Now, if you want the long story of that, I did a quote unquote debate with David Wood a few years ago. And in that debate, I showed, using the Quran as well as this sort of historical critical reading of the Quran, that the Quran does not really deny the crucifixion. I'll try to actually show that here. So I think the Quranic verse on crucifixion is grossly misunderstood. So most people, they just read this. Like there's a whole chain of verses that come in chapter 4 of the Quran. Most people just read this part. As for their saying, we killed the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, messenger of God, yet they did not kill him, neither crucified him, but it was only made to appear to them. So most people read up to this point, and then they say, okay, there was no crucifixion. The Quran denies it. I would beg to disagree with that. So for me, and this is my opinion, but also there's a lot of critical scholars now today, many of whom are not Muslim, who will agree with what I'm about to say. So here, the Quran is not actually denying the crucifixion itself. What the Quran is denying is the claims, the polemical claims of certain, not all, of certain Israelites or certain Jews who claimed to have killed and crucified Jesus. And we know that because the crucifixion verse is the bookend of a larger cluster of verses that begin much earlier. So if we backtrack, the narrative starts around at this point. So the people of the book demand that you, Muhammad, make a book physically come down to them from heaven. And then it talks about how these same people, they demanded Moses show them God face to face. And then these same people worshipped the golden calf. Okay, so then these same people, they broke the Sabbath. It says they broke for their breaking the oath, disbelieving in the signs of God. They slayed the prophets without right. So there's a group of people here who are being criticized for a bunch of misdeeds or sins. And the last accusation or the last misdeed that the group of people are criticized for is for uttering a slander against Mary. You can see that here. And for their saying that they killed Jesus. And then the Quran says they did not kill him. They did not crucify him, but it was only made to appear so to them. So then the question is, well, what was made to appear to them? What was made to appear to them was the fact that they killed Jesus. Okay? It's not denying that Jesus was killed. It's denying the agency of the enemies of Jesus who boast about crucifying him. What the Quran says right after this, it says God raised Jesus to himself. That's right over here. You can see that God raised Jesus to himself, which means God took Jesus away from earth, which is actually compatible with the idea that Jesus did die on the cross. The only difference is that the death of Jesus is not really caused by his enemies. The death of Jesus is caused by God, because according to the Quran, life and death are in the hands of God. They're not really, it is God who decides when somebody lives and when somebody dies. Now, I can show you a parallel verse, which is very similar in theme. There's a parallel verse in Surah 355 where God says to Jesus, I will cause you to die and will raise you to me. Now, this is very interesting because it's basically linking the death of Jesus with the raising of Jesus to God. Like, these are basically the same event. So in conclusion, the Quran is not denying the fact that Jesus died on the cross. The Quran is only denying the agency of the enemies of Jesus who took credit for making this happen. And on this point, if we look at the intertext, okay, we have the book of Acts. So in the book of Acts, this is in the New Testament, Peter is preaching to the Israelites, and he tells the Israelites that this man, Jesus, was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death. in my opinion, what the Quran is saying is an echo of what Peter is saying in the book of Acts. Peter is saying that the death of Jesus, although it was at the hands of the Israelites in this narrative, it was in line, it was according to God's plan and foreknowledge. So it's actually God who's ultimately responsible for the death of Jesus, not the enemies of Jesus. And of course, there's also an intertext here, the Talmud. Okay, and this is the well-known passage in the Talmud where the rabbis claim that they are the ones who put Jesus on trial and then executed him on Passover by hanging, and then they hung his body, basically. So sorry, the rabbis claim that they stoned Jesus and then they hung his body. Many scholars now believe that the Quran is refuting these passages in the Talmud. So again, the Quran, in my opinion, it does not deny the historical crucifixion of Jesus. So I don't actually see a problem on that point. I don't really see a conflict between the Quran and the Bible on the point of the crucifixion. And that's my view. But again, irrespective of that, the Quran, in my opinion, doesn't affirm the New Testament anyway. What the Quran affirms are parts of the extant teachings of Jesus that could still be found in the New Testament. Now the other question was, what about Ezra, right? So why does, what is the Quran talking about? Why does it say that Ezra is the son of God and this sort of thing? All right. So firstly, let me just put that verse up because I think it's important we look at it. All right, so here we go. I'll just put it on my screen. And again, this is not new to your show, obviously, this verse. Okay, so this is the verse in question. And it says here that the Quran here is talking about certain Jews and certain Christians, because they're I mean, we can't get into it right now, but the historical context behind Surah 9, this part of Surah 9, pertains to the Byzantine Christian Empire. And the Byzantines are also part of the historical context for Surah 5. So the Quran begins by saying they, i.e. Jews and Christians, have taken their rabbis and monks, as well as the Messiah, that's Jesus, as lords besides God. So we have this portion. And then it continues. So we can just continue the narrative here. Actually, sorry, not continue, but we have to go back. Let me just show both verses here. Okay, so these are they're both verses. So the verse right before, rather, is the one where Ezra is mentioned. So here we go. So I read 931, but we want to ask about 930. So the reason why I showed 931, though, that there's a reason why it's here. So I want you to notice that in 931, it specifically mentions rabbis, right? And it mentions Jesus. So I propose that what's happening in 930 is also going to parallel that. So here in 930, we have the Jews claiming that Ezra is the son of God, and then the Christians claim that Jesus is the son of God. And then in 931, that's paralleled. We have rabbis. So the Jews are taking the rabbis as lords besides Allah, and the Christians are taking the monks and, again, Jesus as lords besides Allah. So I want you to firstly see that there's a content parallelism between these two verses. So who is Ezra then? So what I'm about to say is this is not my research, and this is not my opinion that I'm going to share. I want to give due credit to the scholars who've done this. Okay. So Holger Zelentin, who is a top-notch scholar of Quranic studies, especially on this topic, he just gave a talk on this. So before I explain, like, again, I believe in giving due credit. before I explain what he said, I just want people to be aware of that original video. So I'm just going to go to the original video, if that's okay. Just bringing it up,
Sure.
and I just want to show people what that video is, because I don't feel right, just using someone else's research without showing who that person is. So right here, you see this first link here, Holger Zelentin, the divine authorship of the Mishnah. Okay. Everyone, after this, you should go watch his entire video, because this is from him. Okay. I'm just telling you what he said at the end of his video. Okay. So now that you know this is his work, let me show you the passage that Holger Zelentin points to for the reference of Ezra. So firstly, the Arabic word, they got translated as Ezra, but the Arabic word is Uzair. Okay, the Arabic word is Uzair. So the question is, who is Uzair? And why is Uzair associated with being the son of Allah on one hand? Why is Uzair associated with Jews? And why is Uzair paralleled with rabbis in the next verse? This is what Holger Zelentin says. So here we go. We have here a part of the Jerusalem Talmud. Okay, Jerusalem Talmud. So according to Holger Zelentin, the reference to Uzair in the Quran, i.e., the Jews say Uzair is the son of Allah, and the reason why it's linked to the rabbis in the next verse is this passage in the Quran is responding to a story found in the Jerusalem Talmud, and I'm going to find it. I just did a word search, my son. Okay, so here's the story, and I'm going to try to simplify it. So basically, there's a rabbi named Rabbi Eliezer. I don't know if I'm saying it right, but Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, so in this story, Rabbi Eliezer is having a debate with other rabbis. Okay, they're having a debate about Jewish law. So in the debate, I'm not going to tell you what the debate exactly was about, but it was a debate about food purity, and the rabbis were on different sides. So Rabbi Eliezer, he's alone, and all the other rabbis are against him. Okay, so that's how it is. It's like one versus everybody else. So as the debate is going on, Rabbi Eliezer, he performs like a number of miracles to show that his view on the issue is correct. So the last miracle that the rabbi shows is, it says here, there came an unembodied voice. This is a voice from heaven. So this is basically the voice of God. So the last argument of the Rabbi Eliezer is to show that God in heaven agrees with his opinion. Okay, so there's a voice from heaven which says the practice follows my son Eliezer. Okay, so in this Talmudic story, which you can find in other versions of the Talmud slightly modified, God in heaven takes the side of Rabbi Eliezer, and he declares Eliezer as his son. It says, the practice follows my son. The other rabbis continue to disagree, basically. In another version of this story, this is in a very, very like a different Talmud, right? A similar story. The same thing happens, except Eliezer he's not called God's son, but again, his view is what God in heaven basically authorizes. And at the end of the other version of the story, the other rabbis, they overrule Rabbi Eliezer. Like they overrule him, and they basically say that it does not matter what heaven says about the Torah. The correct view is what the rabbis on earth say. Okay, this is the same story in another here. You know what? I'll just I'll just show it to you guys. So this is like another Talmud, the same story. Okay, the same thing happens where a voice from heaven, right? Rabbi Eliezer said, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. A divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, as the halakha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he gives an opinion? So let's just take a step back here. So some of you guys might be, well, what does this have to do with anything? Okay, let's go back. Just remind ourselves what the Quran is saying. So the Quran is saying that the Jews have taken rabbis as lords besides God. Basically, this is an accusation from the Quran that the rabbinical Jews are granting divine authority to their rabbis. They have the authority to prescribe and prohibit divine law. The Quran is saying the Jews have given it to their rabbis. And the story that I showed you in the Talmud, it basically says that. Like in both Talmudic stories, the collective of rabbis, they overrule what the divine opinion in heaven is. In fact, in the conclusion of one of those stories here, after this happens, and the rabbis, they don't take the side of heaven. They take their own, the rabbis follow their own interpretation over the heavenly interpretation. So the majority outrules God in heaven. And according to the commentary, the Gemara, many years later, Rabbi Nathan encountered Elijah the prophet and said, what did the Holy One do at the time when Rabbi Yehoshua issued his declaration? This is when they overruled the rabbi backed by heaven. And it says, the Holy One smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. So this is God in the rabbinical tradition basically saying that, yes, my children, the rabbis, they have overruled me. So in my view, following what Dr. Holger Zelentin said in his presentation, which I encourage everybody to watch, these two verses of the Quran are engaging with these Talmudic stories that I just showed. And that the person here, this is Uzair in Arabic. Uzair refers not to Ezra. Uzair refers to this Rabbi Eliezer. Again, I'm not sure if I'm saying Eliezer right, but that's who Uzair is. And in what I showed you, and this is in Holger Zelentin's presentation, so people should watch it. Holger does cite this verse that we're talking about, and he cites the passage where God in the Talmud calls this rabbi his son. So in the scholarly view now, that's basically what this passage was really about. And again, you can only know this if you read the Quran in the manner that a critical scholar reads the Quran, in conversation with late antiquity. If you read the Quran in conversation with what's happening in the year 1500, I think this interpretation is just going to escape you.
That's intriguing. So the person that was thought to be a reference to Ezra is actually a reference to Eliezer.
Yes.
And how did it then become believed that this was Ezra instead of Eliezer?
So basically, what tends to happen in many religious traditions is, as the community sort of develops from the original founders generation, so now we're going 100 years later, 200 years later, these later Muslims, they forget the late antique milieu of the Quran. So Muslims living in the year 750, which is like the first Quran commentaries we have, they date to around the year 750, which is over 100 years after the Quran's own time. So what many Muslims do is they read the Quran, but they don't know the late antique context of many Quranic words and figures. So then they just start speculating. Well, okay, who's Uzair? We don't know. They go around, they ask other people. They may have asked some other Jews and Christians. There's a lot of Quranic commentary that's actually based on what scholars called Israeliyat, that is apocryphal Jewish and Christian ideas that survived, well into Islamic times. So a lot of Muslim exegetes, they just assumed that Ezra must be a prophet of some kind, who some Jews revered as God. And it is alleged in some Muslim sources that there was a Jewish sect that believes this. I don't know how strong that attestation is historically, but you can find some reference to that. But that's basically what happens when people interpret scripture in a later era, because they don't use historical critical readings. They use a theological reading that's only relevant to their time. There's an information loss that happens, and that's probably what happened over here.
We have a couple other super chats. Forum Galorum, thank you for your super chat. Religion will persist so long as men fear death. Sigmund Freud, the death of an illusion. Well, Forum, thank you for your super chat, but that question has nothing to do with this topic, so I'm moving on. Cool Full 1980, thank you for your super chat. What are Ismailoh's view on Paul?
So I can say that, like, I don't think I've seen Paul mentioned in any Ismaili work, but there is a general Shia Muslim understanding of Paul. So one of my friends, his name is Bilal Muhammad. I can try to bring this up. So a friend of mine wrote an article that you can find online about this very topic. And it's basically called Muslim Perspectives on Paul. So I'm just going to put it up on my screen. Yeah, right here. So this is on the Berkeley Institute for Islamic Studies website. And this is a very good article. It goes through Sunni views of Paul, and it goes through Shi'i views of Paul. Ismailis are part of the Shi'i tradition. Basically, the Shi'i view of Paul is very negative. Shia, like, we have statements attributed to the spiritual leaders, the imams, who Shia Muslims follow, which basically refer to Paul in very negative terms. Paul is seen as someone who corrupted the revelation or the message of Jesus for later generations. So in the Shia tradition, he's viewed negatively. In the Sunni tradition, he is viewed more positively. And again, all the references could be found in this particular article.
And my final question before we close, can you refer to the audience where you would recommend them to go for good sources on, like, good scholarship on the Quran, good critical scholarship on the Quran, rather than finding the more extreme polemical sources?
Sure. Basically, first, there are many authors who are part of what I referred to earlier, the Quranic Studies Association. So we have authors like Gabriel Said Reynolds, for example, Juan Cole, Nikolai Sinai, Angelica Neuwirth, Walid Saleh, Imran al-Badawi, who I referenced, Holger Zelentin. These are all academics. Of course, I mean, I'm an academic too. And look, we're all biased, all right? Like, nobody is unbiased. But what I find good about the academic study of the Quran is that despite our biases, everyone in our field, we do have some commitment to a methodology, which basically says, look, if I want to make claims about what the Quran means, then there's a certain bunch of rules that I have to follow to make my argument. I can't make an argument based on my theological beliefs. And I do have theological beliefs. And many of these people I named, they have theological beliefs too, right? But what's beneficial, just as if you wanted to learn about historical Jesus or the New Testament, you would go to the authors that, Jacob, you've had on your show. Like, we would be like, I read Bart Ehrman, I read James Tabor, right? I read some of these authors, some authors maybe you haven't had, like James Dunn and these people. So just as you would go to critical historians to really understand what Jesus said or what the Bible says, we should go to the same type of method scholars when it comes to the Quran. The last thing I want to just add is I found it was a bit ironic seeing the sort of Islamic dilemma presented on this channel, because anyone who watches this channel will have seen your interviews with historians of Jesus, right? And you probably heard this many times, Jacob, but your audience would have heard from James Tabor and Bart Ehrman and others that basically, according to the majority of historians of Jesus, if not the consensus, it's now recognized that the historical Jesus was a Jewish monotheist. He didn't preach the Trinity historically. He didn't preach the incarnation, and Jesus did not even preach substitutionary atonement. You just had Bart Ehrman on the other day. Like, those are not part of the historical teachings of Jesus, right? So what the historical Jesus taught, from what we can gather, what scholars have gathered, is that he followed the law of Moses. He taught the law of Moses. He also taught other teachings, like, inner more spiritual teachings, interpreting the law of Moses. He was a monotheist. He worshipped and believed in one God, right? And he did not teach that his death on the cross was atonement for sins. All these teachings came afterwards. Like, they came some of them come many generations after Jesus. So the thought I wanted to end with is, from a theological perspective, what the Quran ascribes to Jesus generally agrees with what historians today believe Jesus actually taught. The Quranic Jesus is a monotheistic Israelite, Torah abiding prophet. He's not a son of God. He's not an incarnation. He doesn't die for anyone's sins. So it's ironic that, like, the Islamic dilemma is being evoked on a channel where, if you absorb what other speakers on your channel have said, and these guys go on many YouTube channels, but if you just let's just take James Tabor, for example, right? He's a critical scholar. He has his religious beliefs too, but he's a critical scholar. And James Tabor, in his own book, has said that there are great similarities between what he believes the historical Jesus and the historical James taught, and the teachings we find in the Quran, both about Jesus and about salvation, right? So Jesus and James taught a soteriology based on faith and works, not based on vicarious atonement. And they taught Jesus was a prophet. The Quranic message, in actuality, is very much in line with what critical scholars believe Jesus taught and stood for. So my final thought would be, from a historical perspective, there not only is there no Islamic dilemma, but I think there is an Islamic continuity, at least a Quranic continuity, between the teachings of the historical Jesus and some of the teachings that we find in the Quran. And there's so much continuity that some Quranic scholars, one is Patricia Crona. Patricia Crona wrote a 2-part article arguing that the Quranic view of Jesus is basically the Jewish Christian view, which is the original view of Jesus and his disciples. So the Quran very much comes out on the side of the historical Jesus and his disciples in terms of the Quran's theology and its prophetology. The biggest difference only would be the Quran recognizes Muhammad as the last and greatest messenger, whereas the Jewish Christians saw Jesus as the last and greatest messenger of the one God, who's not a Trinity. So that's sort of my final remark.
Well, before we close, we do have one more super chat that I'll read from. It just came in. Grays174, thank you for your super chat. Other than the virgin birth, do you think the historical Jesus is in any way incompatible with the Islamic Jesus?
Well, it depends what we mean by Islamic Jesus. So I would differentiate Quranic Jesus and Islamic Jesus. Quranic Jesus is just the Jesus figure in the Quran. Islamic Jesus is the Quranic Jesus interpreted in line with other beliefs. So I don't know whether you meant Islamic or Quranic, but let's just start with Quranic. So here's what I will say about the Quranic Jesus. I believe that what the Quran does is it's primarily concerned with the theological portrait of Jesus. So the Quran's main concern is to tell Christians and others that Jesus was not God, he's a prophet. But the way the Quran does this is the Quran picks up famous circulating stories about Jesus from post-biblical sources, and the Quran retells them with a correct theology. The best example of this would be the virgin birth stories. So the Quran has picked up ideas that you find in the virgin birth narratives from post-biblical texts, such as the Proto-Evangelium of James, as well as possibly the infancy gospel of Thomas. The Quran picks up those stories, it retells them, it doesn't copy them, it retells them, but it makes like a major modification, namely in both Quranic birth narratives, whereas in the Proto-Evangelium of James, Jesus says he's the Son of God, right? Similarly, in infancy gospel of Thomas, Jesus does miracles as God or as God's Son. In the Quranic retelling, Jesus goes out of his way to say that he's a prophet and he's a servant of God. So I believe the Quran does its theology through re-narrativizing older stories. So in that sense, I don't believe that the Quranic stories about Jesus, such as virgin birth or making birds out of clay, I don't believe those are historical. But what I do believe is historically accurate is the Quranic Christology, i.e., the idea of Jesus as a prophet, as a Messiah who's human and who does things by God's permission. I believe, and I think critical historians will agree, that this was the type of Christology that Jesus and his apostles believed in, and there were Jewish Christian groups who took up that Christology. In my view, that Christology is fully in line with what we find in the Quran. So instead of an Islamic dilemma, I think, in my humble opinion, what we really have is closer to an Islamic continuity with the historical Jesus and the beliefs of his own disciples.
And I just remind everybody real quick that the link to Khalil's website is in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Khalil, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.